Welcome back. We are back with Fear, Extraction Point. I am the solo gamer, and we have just had what appears to be a reconciliation with Alma. At least her younger self and her older self now seem to no longer be at odds, but now I get the distinct impression it's a fight.
Stay sharp.
It's a fight all the way through.
Keep your eyes open for that Blackhawk.
Oh yeah, this is
You should know better by now.
this is the grand finale. One final battle. Now, you get laser. Instead of trapping this entire area, turn this entire area into a war zone. They want me, they're gonna have to earn me. But this is the final, this is the big showdown. And on higher difficulty levels, this is an absolute nightmare. Like, this fight is a brutal slugfest. On the lower difficulties, it's fun, but it's no real challenge. If you've got enough supplies and equipment left over from previous missions, or you're just fast enough to get around the map, you can more or less turn this entire place into a let's turn this place into a trap zone from hell.
You should have a visual on the evac chopper.
And you believe it is time to leave. You can have all the grenades you want. Alright, jerk.
This is Little Bird. We're on the ground. Hurry up so we can get the hell out of here.
Damn. Knew it was too easy. Knew it. But yeah, that's bad.
They tried to bury their sins, but instead planted the seeds of their doom. But she would not be forgotten. We will make them remember. They will die. All of them.
And now Alma's power's bleeding into the rest of the world. So
The war is seen in the dreams. Fire sweeping over the earth, bodies in the streets, and cities turned to dust. Retaliation.
Okay. Now the expansions were not made by the original team that did Fear. They were made by Timegate. They were published under Sierra Vivendi, but they were made by Timegate in association with Monolith Studios. Since Monolith Studios was the original creator of Fear, they helped with the production and provided the assets. Timegate put together the scenarios and the gameplay. And to be fair, like they did a good job. Like, I'm not going to complain. But Timegate was basically brought in because they were trying to salvage. And they wanted to make Fear into a franchise, and they wanted to keep its hype and momentum going. Problem was, after the initial release, Fear was popular and did really well, but it began to peter off. And in so, they realized they had to get on top of it and keep people engaged, and that was what the expansions were meant to do. Excuse me. One thing about living in the desert, you gotta drink constantly. But that being said, they did what I think is a decent job. It's a fine expansion, handles itself very well, has some great jump scares and some really good moments. And it is implied that there's technically two timelines. There's what's known as the Monolith timeline, which is the original Fear. There is the Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate. And then there is there's what I call the Warner Bros. Timeline. Technically, they're called the Vivendi and Monolith timelines, but I call them the Monolith and Warner Brothers timelines, because I do feel like Warner Brothers' influence radically changed the franchise. Personal opinion, of course, but nonetheless, this game was a absolute bulldozer of an experience the first time you played it. Now, as an adult, it still gives me those moments of tension and fright and panic, but perhaps not to the same impact that it did before. Like, I still feel it. And there's still moments where it gets me really hard and really, really deep, and it punches me right in the chest. But I do feel like Warner Brothers, after they bought Monolith, found themselves in an awkward position because they didn't want to have to acknowledge the Vivendi shit outside of Fear 1. But they also couldn't just dump it, because doing that would cause massive schisms in the fan base. So what they kind of did was they acknowledged it, but they said that it was not confirmed or canon. It was just what may have occurred. But that's the thing, like the whole concept of Fear, in a lot of ways, the whole concept of Fear kind of leads into what later happened with stuff like Dead Space, where you try to take like an action oriented, survival horror game, mix it in with unique combat mechanics and systems, and try to make sure that they work together. Of course, what also played into that massively was Resident Evil 4, the behind the camera view. A lot of people don't know this, but the original Dead Space was supposed to be a follow-on to System Shock. And then later on, of course, we got BioShock, but like the whole thing was iterations of a theme. You had Resident Evil 4, and then you had Dead Space, which was going to be a System Shock 3 or something very similar to it. And then Resident Evil 4 came out, and Resident Evil like upended everything that people expected. And so they completely redesigned Dead Space to mimic Resident Evil 4. And like there was a whole long run of events that happened, but eventually, what happened with Sierra Vivendi and the long-term crash of that company was kind of unfortunate because like they were at the time they were one of the most significant developers in their era. Most notably, they were originally like a small turn group, and then they got bought out by another company in 1996. They would go on to continue being part of it, and then 2008, Vivendi merged with Activision, and then eventually formed Activision Blizzard. Because Blizzard, I made a mistake in thinking that it was Blizzard who bought Vivendi. It was actually the reverse. It was Vivendi that actually bought Blizzard, which is what eventually collapsed Sierra because they couldn't afford to keep Sierra running with Blizzard taking up all their resources, and all of the Vivendi Games was eventually dissolved after Activision Blizzard merged with them, and went to all of Sierra's IP went to I think it's now with Blizzard, but unfortunately, like that's what happens. Like Vivendi Games, who is one of the biggest, most prolific developers in their era, they were eventually absorbed by. They eventually became. They eventually merged with Activision, and that was pretty much the end of it. The funny thing about them is that they were so prolific, you can't even imagine. Imagine, at a baseline level, one of their earliest games was Tribes 2 specifically. The Mummy Returns, Hoyle Slots. They also worked with Valve on Half-Life Blue Shift. They did a bunch of other stuff, like Hoyle and Throne of Darkness. And then they made a big name with No One Lives Forever, ever. And then they did a lot of other like secondary stuff. There was a joke going around that they were the sequel team. Basically, if you wanted to make a sequel to an existing game but you didn't have the original developers, you went to Vivendi, and they could do it because they made Aliens vs Predator 2 on Microsoft Windows back in the day, and then they would go on to do Half-Life for the PlayStation. They would do Crash Bandicoot: Wrath of Cortex, and I mean it was just like that was their whole deal. Was like they would pick up these various properties and spin them out into new games. And that was kind of where things really started going. And then, like, Vivendi Games and Vivendi Publishing were unified, but they weren't actually like they weren't actually the same, but they did work together. But it wasn't until Fear that I took notice of them. I'd seen Sierra; they'd been around for a decade before that, but like they were just legendary. And then Fear is where I first really noticed Monolith and Vivendi and Sierra Publishing. But yeah, Fear was developed by Monolith Software. And that was the thing that made them sort of legendary. They were released in 2005 was the first Fear. So you're talking this is 2005 was when this first hit the market. And then the expansions were within 6 months to a year after that. And then after that, that's when Fear 2 eventually would come along, and then Fear 3 later on. But yeah, like Fear is like an example of a game series that honestly I think is simply just unmatched in terms of its impact in the day, but unfortunately it's forgotten because The third game did not land well, sadly. Like the third game wasn't a bad game, but it felt so detached from the fear storylines and the by this point the Vivendi monolith split and the Warner Brothers influence had divided the fan base enormously. And this was one of those things where like that led to the third game not being as well received or as well liked as it should have been because it's a good game on its own. It just it it ran into a lot of trouble from pre-existing problems. But anyway, that's Extraction Point, locked and done. And if I'm being honest, like I love Extraction Point, but it does feel like it was sort of like a thrown together follow on where they took assets that they had used for the original game and then they took other assets that they had created but never gotten around to properly using fully and made another game out of it. And the same thing happened with Extraction Point. Though by the time Extraction Point came around, you could see they were pushing the engine as hard as they could. So, anyway, I'm going to stop it here. I appreciate you joining me on this journey through fear and the Extraction Point. Next time, you should be seeing the first video from Perseus Mandate coming through soon. Well, the second video technically, but and then after Perseus Mandate, Fear 2. I will see you then. This is the Solo Gamer signing out.